Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Quiet Grace of Sophia Gray. The bustling terminal at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was alive with the hum of humanity. Travelers shuffled from gate to gate, clutching their boarding passes and personal belongings, eyes either glued to their phones or darting around nervously at departure screens. Among them, a striking figure moved with quiet dignity. Sophia Gray, a woman in her late 30s with smooth ebony skin and a natural grace, strolled through the chaos. Her tailored pantsuit and soft leather handbag exuded elegance, but it was her composed demeanor that drew the occasional glance. Sophia's day had started like any other. She had a full schedule waiting for her in New York City, where she was slated to deliver a keynote address at a prestigious conference on social equity and leadership. Her career as an author, entrepreneur, and motivational speaker had earned her acclaim in professional circles, but she never let the fame overshadow her core values: humility, kindness, and perseverance. As she approached the boarding gate, she adjusted the strap of her handbag and handed over her first-class ticket to the agent with a warm smile. "Have a wonderful flight, Ms. Gray," the agent said, recognizing her from a book-signing event just a few months earlier. Sophia nodded politely, grateful for the smooth process. She entered the aircraft, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle, and made her way to her assigned seat, a window seat in first class. Placing her bag in the overhead bin, she settled into her seat and gazed out at the tarmac. The city's skyline gleamed in the distance under a blanket of morning sun. For a moment, Sophia allowed herself to relax, soaking in the quiet before the rush of the day ahead. The cabin gradually filled with passengers. Some carried briefcases and laptops, while others clutched travel pillows and paperback novels. As the announcements began, a flight attendant emerged from the galley and started assisting passengers in storing their luggage. She was a young woman in her late 20s, her blonde hair pinned back in a tight bun. Her name tag read Emily. Emily's smile was sharp and perfunctory as she moved through the cabin. When her eyes landed on Sophia, something in her expression shifted. She approached Sophia's row with a clipped gait, her gaze quickly darting to the ticket in Sophia's hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily began, her voice laced with a mix of politeness and irritation. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Sophia, surprised but maintaining her poise, glanced down at her boarding pass. "I don't think so," she replied, offering the pass to Emily for confirmation. Emily barely glanced at the ticket before shaking her head. "This seat is taken," she said curtly, her voice slightly louder than necessary. The surrounding passengers began to take notice. Whispers rippled through the cabin as a few curious faces turned toward the scene. Sophia felt her cheeks warm but refused to lose her composure. "This is my assigned seat," she said gently, pointing to the seat number on the pass. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin," Emily interrupted, her tone firm. "We'll sort this out later." The hush in the cabin deepened. People exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. No one spoke up. Sophia could feel the weight of their stares as she quietly gathered her belongings and stood. With her head held high, she moved toward the rear of the plane, her steps measured and deliberate. As she settled into a seat in the economy cabin, Sophia's mind raced. She had faced microaggressions before, but this felt different, blatant, humiliating, and public. Yet, she refused to dwell on the negativity. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, "Don't let the world define your worth, Sophia. You carry it with you." She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag under the seat in front of her, and prepared herself for the journey. Little did she know, the next few moments would shift the dynamics of the flight in an extraordinary way. Sophia stared out the small window at the runway, lost in thought, when the intercom crackled to life. The captain introduced himself, his deep voice steady and welcoming. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain James Gray, and I'll be your pilot for today's flight to New York City. We're looking at a smooth journey ahead, with a few mild tailwinds to give us an early arrival." At the sound of the captain's name, a few passengers in the economy cabin turned to glance at Sophia, curiosity flickering in their eyes. She noticed the attention but dismissed it as coincidental. Her husband, James, often joked about how pilots became anonymous voices to passengers once the safety briefing ended. And before we take off, Captain Gray continued, I'd like to take a moment to thank my wife, Sophia, for joining me on this flight. It's not every day I get to have my better half on board. His voice carried a warmth that made Sophia smile, despite the awkwardness of her earlier encounter. The reaction in the cabin was immediate and palpable. Heads turned, necks craned, and a ripple of murmurs filled the space. The realization dawned on passengers like a gust of wind through an open door. The dignified woman seated quietly in economy class wasn't just any traveler, she was the pilot's wife. In the first-class cabin, Emily's face turned pale. She stood frozen for a moment, the gravity of her mistake sinking in. The other flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The atmosphere shifted as passengers began to understand what had transpired. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Gray was unaware of the unfolding drama. He was too focused on preparing the aircraft for departure, blissfully unaware of the life lesson about to unfold 30,000 feet above the ground. Unveiling grace in turbulence. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension. Sophia, seated toward the rear, kept her eyes on the horizon outside the small oval window, her face calm but her mind turbulent. She had often spoken to audiences about turning moments of adversity into opportunities, but living those moments was a far more challenging ordeal. Passengers in the surrounding rows exchanged furtive glances. Some whispered softly, clearly piecing together the implications of the captain's announcement. A young boy in the seat across from her tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked in an innocent voice, Mommy, is she the captain's wife? His words were loud enough to carry through the immediate rows, and a few people chuckled nervously. The mother smiled awkwardly and nodded, whispering something to quiet her child. Sophia turned toward the boy, her serene smile dissolving some of the tension in the air. Yes, sweetie, I am, she said softly. The boy's face lit up, and he waved at her enthusiastically. His innocence was a balm to her soul. Meanwhile, in first class, Emily, the flight attendant, couldn't shake the weight of her mistake. Her mind replayed the interaction over and over. She had dismissed Sophia so quickly, so thoughtlessly, all while maintaining the veneer of professionalism. Now, she felt the sting of her own prejudice, sharp and unrelenting. The murmurs from passengers in first class were impossible to ignore. A middle-aged businessman sitting in 1A leaned toward his neighbor. Did you hear that? The woman they sent back to economy is the captain's wife. His companion, a woman with a sharp bob and designer sunglasses perched on her head, frowned. Are you serious? That's unbelievable. She glanced toward the galley, where Emily busied herself, her movements uncharacteristically stiff. It wasn't long before another flight attendant, a more experienced woman named Carol, approached Emily. We've got a situation, and we need to address it, Carol said in a low voice, her tone firm but empathetic. You need to speak to her. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her apron. I didn't know. I mean, how could I have known? Carol's gaze softened slightly, but her words were resolute. It's not about knowing who she is. It's about how you treated her. First-class passengers expect respect, but everyone deserves it. You need to make this right. Back in economy class. Sophia's thoughts were interrupted as a shadow fell over her seat. She glanced up to see Emily standing there, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and determination. The murmurs in the cabin hushed as passengers watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Gray, Emily began, her voice shaky but earnest. I owe you an apology. I made a terrible mistake, and I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. Please, let me escort you back to your seat in first class. Sophia's gaze held steady, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then, with the same quiet grace she had displayed earlier, Sophia spoke. Thank you for your apology, she said, her voice measured and calm. But I'm fine here. There's no need to move me. Emily's face flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably. Please, Mrs. Gray. It's the least we can do after my mistake. Sophia considered this for a moment. She could feel the eyes of nearly every passenger on her. She had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and now she had an opportunity to teach an unspoken lesson. I appreciate the gesture, but I think I'll stay, Sophia said gently. Sometimes, the best way to learn is to sit with the consequences of our actions. I'm comfortable here, and I'm sure the rest of the passengers would appreciate an uneventful flight. Emily's lips parted as if to protest, but she stopped herself. Instead, she nodded slowly, murmured another apology, and returned to the galley. The tension in the cabin dissipated slightly, replaced by a quiet admiration for the woman who had handled the situation with such dignity. A lesson in leadership. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a rhythm. The hum of engines was punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses and murmured conversations. Sophia opened her laptop and began reviewing her notes for the keynote speech she was scheduled to deliver the next day. Her presentation was titled Leadership Through Adversity, Building Bridges in a Divided World. The irony of the day's events wasn't lost on her. As she typed, a man seated across the aisle leaned toward her. He was in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. Mrs. Gray, he said softly, careful not to disturb the other passengers. I just wanted to say, the way you handled that situation earlier was remarkable. I think many of us could learn a lot from you. Sophia looked up from her screen, her warm smile returning. Thank you. It's important to remember that we all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them, whether we choose to grow or let them define us. The man nodded thoughtfully. You're right. And I think you've already inspired more people on this flight than you realize. In the cockpit, Captain Gray, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded, focused on navigating the flight smoothly. His first officer, a younger pilot named Marcus, had been the one to overhear whispers from the cabin crew during a routine check. James, Marcus said carefully, I think you should know, there was a bit of an incident with Sophia. James's brow furrowed. What kind of incident? Marcus explained briefly, choosing his words diplomatically. James listened in silence, his jaw tightening. When Marcus finished, James leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. Sophia always handles herself with grace, he said. I'm sure she's already turned the situation into a teaching moment. But still. He trailed off, his mind racing. His protective instincts warred with his deep respect for Sophia's ability to navigate challenges on her own terms. He resolved to check on her after they landed. For now, his duty was to ensure the safety and comfort of every passenger on board, including the one who meant the most to him. As the flight continued, the ripple effect of Sophia's actions spread quietly but profoundly. Passengers who had initially remained silent began to reflect on their own biases and assumptions. Emily, still grappling with her actions, resolved to approach her work with a renewed sense of fairness and humility. And Sophia, ever the leader, continued to embody the values she championed, dignity, grace, and the unwavering belief in humanity's potential for growth. Turbulence within and without. The steady hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, a monotonous backdrop to the silent reflections of many on board. Sophia Gray remained seated in economy, her posture calm but her mind alert. The words of the passengers around her, their looks of curiosity, awe, and even guilt, swirled like an invisible current. She'd dealt with prejudice before, but each incident was a reminder of the work still to be done. As she typed on her laptop, preparing her presentation, a sudden tremor rippled through the aircraft. The captain's voice broke over the intercom, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, secure the cabin. The plane jolted again, sharper this time, and gasps erupted across the cabin. Sophia saved her work instinctively and closed her laptop, setting it carefully in the seat pocket. Around her, passengers clutched their armrests and whispered nervously. A woman 2 rows ahead murmured a prayer, while a child's cry pierced the tense silence. Emily, the young flight attendant who had dismissed Sophia earlier, appeared at the front of the economy cabin. Her face was pale, but determined as she moved aisle by aisle, checking on passengers and ensuring seatbelts were fastened. When she reached Sophia's row, their eyes met briefly. Emily opened her mouth as if to speak, but hesitated and moved on. Sophia noticed the trembling in her hands as she steadied herself against the overhead bins. In the cockpit, Captain James Gray tightened his grip on the controls. The weather radar had shown a patch of turbulence ahead, but the severity had caught them off guard. Beside him, First Officer Marcus monitored the instruments, his usually steady demeanor tinged with tension. "We're through the worst of it," James said, his voice even. "Keep an eye on the weather patterns ahead. We'll adjust the altitude if necessary." Marcus nodded. "Understood, Captain." He hesitated before adding, I heard about what happened earlier with Mrs. Gray. I just want to say, it's inspiring how she handled it." James glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. "Sophia doesn't just talk about grace and resilience, she lives it. It's one of the many reasons I admire her. Now let's make sure we get everyone safely to New York." In economy class, the turbulence subsided gradually, though the unease lingered. Sophia turned her attention to the young mother seated beside her. The woman clutched her toddler, who was now fast asleep but had clearly been crying earlier. Sophia offered a reassuring smile. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. I'm just a nervous flyer. And with my daughter here, it's even harder." Sophia reached into her bag and retrieved a small, brightly colored toy. "Sometimes a distraction can help," she said, handing it to the woman. "For her, when she wakes up." The mother's expression shifted to one of gratitude. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." Sophia nodded, her warm smile unwavering. It was moments like these, she believed, that revealed the true essence of humanity, compassion in the face of fear. A new understanding. As the flight attendants resumed their service, Emily found herself gravitating toward the back of the plane. Her earlier exchange with Sophia lingered in her mind, and the turbulence had shaken more than just the aircraft. She needed to confront her actions head-on. When the aisle was clear, Emily approached Sophia's row. She crouched slightly to meet Sophia's gaze, her expression earnest. "Mrs. Gray, I need to say something," Emily began, her voice low but resolute. "I was wrong earlier. Not just in how I treated you, but in how I let my assumptions guide me. There's no excuse for it. And watching how you've handled everything today, it's taught me more than I can say." Sophia's eyes softened. She could see the genuine remorse in Emily's expression, and her own heart swelled with empathy. "Thank you, Emily. It takes courage to admit when we've made a mistake. The important thing is to learn from it and do better moving forward." Emily nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'll do everything I can to make sure no one else feels the way I made you feel. Thank you for your kindness." Sophia reached out and gently touched Emily's arm. "We all have the capacity to grow. Don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep striving to be better." The interaction left Emily visibly moved. As she returned to her duties, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and humility. A ripple effect. The turbulence, both physical and emotional, seemed to have passed. The rest of the flight was relatively uneventful, but the impact of the day's events lingered in subtle yet profound ways. Passengers who had witnessed the incident earlier now saw Sophia in a new light. Some approached her quietly to offer words of appreciation or share their own stories of overcoming prejudice. Others simply observed, reflecting on their own biases and behaviors. Sophia's calm presence and willingness to engage with others turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful lesson. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, the mood in the cabin had shifted. Strangers exchanged smiles, and conversations flowed more freely. It was as if the collective spirit of the passengers had been lifted by an invisible force. A reunion on solid ground. When the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the usual flurry of activity ensued. Passengers retrieved their belongings and prepared to disembark. Sophia waited patiently, allowing others to go ahead. As she stood to gather her things, Emily approached one last time. "Mrs. Gray," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "thank you again. For everything. I hope one day I can embody even a fraction of the grace you've shown today." Sophia smiled warmly. "You're already on your way, Emily. Remember, growth is a journey, not a destination." As Sophia stepped off the plane, she was greeted by James, who stood just outside the cockpit door. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and he opened his arms wide. "There's my favorite passenger," he said, his voice filled with love and pride. Sophia embraced him tightly, drawing strength from his presence. As they walked together toward the terminal, James glanced at her. "Rough flight?" Sophia chuckled softly. "Let's just say it was an opportunity to practice what I preach." James laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "That's my Sophia. Always turning challenges into lessons." As they exited the terminal and stepped into the bustling city, Sophia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had turned a moment of adversity into a catalyst for growth, not just for herself, but for everyone who had witnessed it. And she knew her journey was far from over. The power of the unexpected. The airport terminal was buzzing with activity, a chaotic symphony of announcements, hurried footsteps, and the occasional laughter of reunited families. James and Sophia Gray stepped into the fray together, their hands brushing lightly as they walked. Despite the challenges of the flight, Sophia felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose, as though the turbulence had stirred something profound within her. "You know," James began, breaking into her thoughts, "I always tell my co-pilots that no flight goes exactly as planned. It's how we handle the unexpected that defines us." He glanced at her with a smile. "I'd say you handled today pretty spectacularly." Sophia chuckled. "Well, I did have a pretty good example to follow." Her voice was warm, but her mind lingered on the events of the day. The flight had been a microcosm of society, its prejudices, its moments of fear, and its capacity for redemption. She wondered how the passengers and crew might carry those lessons forward. As they exited the terminal, a familiar face appeared through the crowd. A tall woman with curly hair and a beaming smile waved enthusiastically. "Sophia." "James." It was Natalie Carter, a journalist and close friend who had long admired Sophia's work. "I heard you were flying in today," Natalie said as she embraced Sophia. "How was the trip?" Sophia exchanged a glance with James, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Eventful," she replied simply. A call to action. Later that evening, as the city's lights twinkled outside their hotel room, Sophia sat at her laptop, her fingers poised over the keyboard. She had decided to turn the day's experience into a story, not just for her upcoming keynote but for a wider audience. She knew that her words could amplify the lessons learned on that plane and spark conversations that reached far beyond the confines of an aircraft cabin. The headline she typed was simple but evocative: "When Grace Takes Flight, Lessons in Humanity at 30,000 Feet." Sophia began recounting the events, weaving the narrative with the same authenticity and insight that had made her a sought-after speaker and writer. She described the flight attendant's initial dismissal, the turbulence that tested everyone's resolve, and the heartfelt moments of connection that followed. Most importantly, she focused on the transformation, how one woman's apology and a collective willingness to reflect had turned an uncomfortable situation into an opportunity for growth. As she wrote, Sophia felt the weight of responsibility that came with her platform. She didn't want to shame or blame, she wanted to inspire change. Her words were an invitation, a call to examine biases, embrace humility, and approach every encounter with empathy. Ripples of change. The next morning, Sophia's article went live on her blog and social media channels. Within hours, it began to gain traction. Readers from around the world shared their thoughts in the comments, many recounting their own experiences with prejudice or moments of unexpected kindness. One comment read, "I've been in Emily's shoes, making snap judgments and regretting them later. This story reminded me to slow down and see people for who they really are. Thank you, Sophia, for sharing this." Another wrote, "As a flight attendant, this hit close to home. It's so easy to get caught up in the rush and forget the humanity of the people we serve. I'll be carrying this story with me on every flight from now on." Sophia read each comment with a mixture of gratitude and humility. The response affirmed her belief in the power of storytelling to ignite change. Emily's reflection. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Emily sat in her apartment, her tablet propped on the coffee table. She had come across Sophia's article through a mutual acquaintance who had shared it online. As she read, Emily felt a wave of emotions, embarrassment, gratitude, and a deep resolve to do better. Sophia's words didn't just recount the events of the flight, they illuminated the broader context of implicit bias and the importance of self-awareness. For Emily, it was like holding up a mirror to her own actions. That evening, Emily drafted an email to Sophia. It wasn't easy to find the right words, but she poured her heart into the message. "Dear Mrs. Gray, I just read your article, and I want to thank you for sharing your perspective with such grace and compassion. Reading it helped me see my actions in a new light, and I'm committed to growing from this experience. I've already started having conversations with my colleagues about how we can ensure every passenger feels valued and respected. Your kindness has inspired me more than you know. Sincerely, Emily." A stage for change. The day of the conference arrived, and Sophia stood backstage, preparing to deliver her keynote. The auditorium was packed, with attendees from various industries eager to hear her insights on leadership and social equity. As she adjusted the microphone on her lapel, she felt a familiar flutter of nerves, not from fear but from the anticipation of connection. When she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. Sophia smiled warmly and began her speech with a story. "A few days ago, I was on a flight that taught me more about leadership than any book or course ever could. It was a lesson in humility, grace, and the power of human connection." As she recounted the events, weaving in broader themes of empathy and growth, the audience was captivated. Sophia's words were both personal and universal, resonating deeply with those who had ever faced or perpetuated prejudice. By the time she concluded, the room was silent, a collective stillness that spoke volumes. Then came the applause, thunderous, heartfelt, and sustained. Sophia knew that the impact of her words would extend far beyond that room. The journey continues. After the conference, Sophia returned to the hotel, exhausted but fulfilled. James greeted her with a glass of sparkling water and a knowing smile. "How was it?" he asked. Sophia sank into the couch beside him. "Incredible. But the work is never done." James nodded. "That's what makes it worthwhile." As the evening wore on, Sophia reflected on how a single moment, a dismissive glance, a quiet apology, a shared understanding, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully know. The flight had been just one chapter in her journey, but it reaffirmed her belief in the power of grace, resilience, and the enduring human capacity for change. A legacy takes flight. The sun rose over New York City, casting its golden light across the skyscrapers and busy streets. For Sophia Gray, this morning felt different, full of possibility and reflection. She sat by the window of her hotel room, sipping her coffee as the events of the past few days played in her mind. The keynote speech had been a success, and her article had sparked conversations far beyond what she had imagined. But for Sophia, this wasn't the end, it was a beginning. James emerged from the adjoining room, his tie loosely hanging around his neck. "What's next on your agenda?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. Sophia smiled. "A meeting with Natalie to discuss a potential collaboration. She wants to amplify the story's impact, and I think we can do something meaningful together." James leaned back, his expression filled with admiration. "You have a way of turning moments into movements." I hope you realize that. Sophia's smile deepened, but her thoughts were already on the meeting ahead. She knew that their story, had the potential to inspire change on a much larger scale. The catalyst. Later that morning, Sophia met Natalie Carter at a small cafe, tucked away in Manhattan's West Village. Natalie, a seasoned journalist with a knack for storytelling, had been one of Sophia's earliest supporters. Today, her excitement was palpable. "Sophia, the response to your article has been incredible," Natalie began, her hands gesturing animatedly. "People are sharing it like wildfire, and I've received countless messages asking for follow-ups. I think this is our chance to create something lasting." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking the same. Stories like this can't just be a momentary spark, they need to ignite sustained dialogue and action." Natalie leaned forward. "What if we create a documentary? We could explore the themes of your article in depth: bias, growth, and the human capacity for change. We could interview passengers from the flight, the crew, and others with similar experiences." Sophia's eyes lit up. "That could be powerful. But it has to be authentic. We need to show the struggles as well as the triumphs. And I'd want Emily's voice to be part of it, too. Her growth is just as important as the broader message." Natalie smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way. Let's make this happen." A chance encounter. As Sophia and Natalie walked out of the cafe, a voice called out behind them. "Mrs. Gray?" They turned to see a young woman in a navy blazer, her face a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "I hope I'm not intruding," she began, "but I recognized you from your article. I just wanted to say thank you." Sophia tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Thank you? For what?" The woman smiled nervously. "For sharing your story. I'm a manager at an airline, and your words made me take a hard look at our training programs. I've already started conversations about how we can address bias among our staff. It's going to be a long road, but your story gave me the push I needed." Sophia's heart swelled. "Thank you for telling me that. Change often starts with one person willing to take the first step. I'm glad my story could be part of your journey." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's more than that. You've shown me what leadership really looks like." "Thank you." As the woman walked away, Natalie turned to Sophia, her expression thoughtful. "Moments like that, they're why your voice matters so much." Sophia smiled, feeling both humbled and energized. "Let's make sure more people have the chance to find their voice, too." Emily's transformation. Back in Chicago, Emily was already living out her commitment to growth. She had shared Sophia's article with her colleagues, sparking a series of candid discussions about bias and professionalism. The airline's leadership took notice, inviting Emily to help revamp their training modules with a focus on empathy and cultural sensitivity. One day, as Emily prepared to lead a workshop for new recruits, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a signed copy of Sophia's latest book, accompanied by a handwritten note. "Dear Emily, your courage to confront and grow from this experience inspires me. Remember, leadership isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance and purpose. Keep shining. Warmly, Sophia Gray." Emily clutched the note, her resolve strengthening. She realized that her journey, and the lessons she could teach others, had only just begun. The legacy of Flight 327. Months later, the documentary Sophia and Natalie envisioned became a reality. Titled Flight 327, A Journey Toward Grace, it premiered at an international film festival, to critical acclaim. The film chronicled not just Sophia's experience, but also the ripple effects it created, from Emily's transformation to the airline manager's reforms, and the countless individuals inspired to reflect on their own biases. The final scene of the documentary featured a simple but powerful moment: Sophia and Emily sitting together, sharing their perspectives on the flight that had changed both their lives. Their conversation was raw, honest, and hopeful, encapsulating the core message of the film. As the credits rolled, audiences around the world were left with a profound sense of possibility. The story of Flight 327 became more than a headline, it became a movement. Sophia's continued mission. In the years that followed, Sophia continued to champion the values she had lived by that day on the plane. She launched an initiative called Grace in Action, which provided resources and training to organizations looking to address bias and foster inclusivity. The initiative partnered with schools, businesses, and community groups, creating spaces for dialogue and growth. Through it all, Sophia remained grounded in her belief that change begins with individuals willing to take small but meaningful steps. And every now and then, she and James would reminisce about that fateful flight, marveling at how a moment of adversity had transformed into a legacy of grace. As Sophia prepared to board yet another plane, this time to deliver a speech at the United Nations, she paused at the gate, looking out at the aircraft waiting on the tarmac. She smiled, her heart filled with gratitude and resolve. The journey was far from over, but she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.